5 times faster. That's not marketing language. That's the gap modern gut research has measured between the fashionable fermented drink sitting in your refrigerator and the ancient fermented drink that nourished the people of Scripture for over 2,000 years. Kombucha earned its moment. It deserves it. The research on fermented tea is real. But long before the first SCOBY was cultured, long before the first bottle appeared on a grocery shelf, there was a drink made from 4 ingredients in a clay pot in a Judean kitchen. It was thicker than kombucha. It was sourer. It was richer. And the microbial diversity inside it was on an entirely different scale. Research suggests it may be associated with restoring intestinal balance, roughly 5 times faster than kombucha, for one simple reason. It contains what biologists call a polymicrobial community, meaning a far wider range of strains, and many of those strains match the ones lining a healthy human gut. Kombucha gives you a handful. This gives you dozens. Picture the scene for a moment. A Judean kitchen in the heat of the afternoon, sometime around the 2nd millennium before Christ. The stone walls hold the cool of the morning a little longer than the air outside, which shimmers above the courtyard. In the corner sits a small leather vessel, a skin bag stitched at the seams and suspended from a wooden peg, slowly swaying as the woman of the household passes by. Inside that skin is the milk of the family's goats, drawn at sunrise, already changing character hour by hour. A ladle of yesterday's sour milk was stirred in before the heat of noon. By the time the sun tilts westward, the contents have thickened, tanged, and turned into something entirely new. When the traveler arrives dusty from the road, it is this vessel the woman reaches for, not the fresh milk that would have spoiled within hours. She pours a thick, cloudy, faintly effervescent drink into a wooden cup and hands it to him. He drinks. He is refreshed in a way he cannot quite explain. That vessel, that practice, that drink is what we're talking about today. The drink has several names depending on where in the ancient Near East you find it. The Hebrew sources call it chamitza or simply the sour milk. In Greek texts, it's referred to as oxygala, which literally means sour milk. In modern terms, it is closest to what we would recognize as kefir, though the 1st century version was significantly more potent than most mass-produced kefir on store shelves today. It appears indirectly throughout Scripture. Genesis chapter 18 records Abraham offering milk and the calf to 3 visitors at the Oak of Mamre, and the tradition within rabbinic commentary understands that milk, served in a hot desert afternoon as a soured, fermented preparation that had kept safely in its leather vessel. Judges chapter 5. The Song of Deborah describes Jael offering Sisera butter in a lordly dish when what he had asked for was water. That butter in the original text is a thick, fermented dairy. Proverbs chapter 30 speaks of the churning of milk bringing forth butter. None of this is incidental. A culture of people living in a hot climate without refrigeration had exactly one way to keep milk useful past the hour it came from the goat. They fermented it, and the product that emerged was observed to support health in ways they could see but couldn't explain. Here's what they couldn't have known. A traditional Middle Eastern kefir, cultured, with the original granular kefir grains, contains between 30 and 60 distinct microbial species. Some research has identified upwards of 50 strains in a single well-maintained culture. Compare this to kombucha, which typically contains between 5 and 15 strains in a mature brew, most of them yeasts, and a narrower band of acetic acid bacteria. The gut lining of a healthy adult human is colonized by hundreds of bacterial species, with Lactobacillus, Bifidobacterium, and Streptococcus families playing central roles. Kefir delivers large populations of exactly these families. Kombucha delivers a much narrower range. When researchers compare the restoration of gut barrier markers in human trials, the gap is substantial. A 2017 study in the journal Nutrients examined fermented dairy intake and reported statistically significant improvements in intestinal permeability markers within 2 weeks of daily consumption. A 2020 meta-analysis across kefir trials associated regular intake with favorable shifts in multiple gut health indicators. A 2019 review published in Frontiers in Microbiology catalogued the full microbial census of traditional kefir grains and identified dozens of named species, including Lactobacillus kefiri, Lactobacillus kefiranofaciens, Lactococcus lactis, and several Saccharomyces and Cloiveromyces yeasts working in concert. A 2015 paper in the Journal of Dairy Science reported that grain-cultured kefir produced a significantly broader profile of bioactive peptides than starter-cultured versions of the same milk. The ancients had no microscope. They had no word for microbiome. But they observed that people who drank the sour milk daily reported fewer digestive complaints, recovered more quickly from illness, and lived longer. Scripture didn't use those words. It simply included the drink in daily life. To understand why this drink is so different from anything else, in the modern fermented aisle, you have to understand what a kefir grain actually is. Hold one in your hand, and it looks like a small, pale cauliflower floret, rubbery and slick, faintly sour-smelling. What you are holding is not a single organism. It is a living symbiosis, a self-assembling micro-ecosystem of dozens of bacterial and yeast species, bound together inside a structural matrix made of a polysaccharide called kefirin. Kefirin is produced primarily by Lactobacillus kefiranofaciens, and it serves as the scaffolding. Within that scaffolding, lactic acid bacteria, acetic acid bacteria, and yeasts cohabit in stable ratios, each feeding on the metabolic byproducts of the others. The yeasts consume the sugars the bacteria can't fully use. The bacteria produce acids that protect the yeasts from competing organisms. Carbon dioxide released by one member becomes substrate for another. It is, in the most literal sense, a small city of life held together by a shared wall. And here is the remarkable part. No laboratory has ever successfully reconstructed kefir grains from scratch. You cannot buy the species separately, combine them in a jar, and grow grains. The matrix only continues from a mother culture. Every traditional kefir grain in the world today traces back to an original culture that has been passed hand to hand, household to household, for an unbroken span that some researchers place in the thousands of years. The milk, inoculated with grains, is covered loosely with a cloth so gases can escape, and left at cool room temperature for 18 to 24 hours. During that time, the microbes metabolize lactose, producing lactic acid, carbon dioxide, small amounts of ethanol, a spectrum of B vitamins, and vitamin K2 in the menaquinone 7, or MK7 form, which research has associated with supporting arterial and bone health. They also produce conjugated linoleic acid, a fatty acid that several studies have linked to favorable metabolic markers. They generate a wide range of bioactive peptides, including ACE inhibitory peptides that research suggests may support healthy blood pressure, and smaller peptide fragments that have been studied for possible immune-modulating effects. They release kefiran itself into the liquid, where it has been associated in laboratory studies with supporting gut barrier function. The milk thickens. It develops a sharp, tangy, slightly effervescent character. After the fermentation window, the grains are strained out and saved for the next batch. The liquid that remains is true traditional kefir, thick, cloudy, complex, and it will keep safely refrigerated for at least a week. Unrefrigerated, in ancient times, it kept for several days, simply because the acidic environment it had created was inhospitable to most spoilage organisms. The same chemistry that made it useful also made it storable. Two birds, one elegant design. Now here is what sets this apart from the grocery store kefir most people have tried. Commercial kefir is typically made without grains. Manufacturers use a standardized freeze-dried starter culture with perhaps 6 to 10 strains, shelf-stable, reproducible, industrially, optimized for consistent flavor and texture across millions of bottles. It is still associated with some benefit, but it is a fundamentally narrower version of the original. The grain matrix is absent. Kefirin production is minimal. The broader spectrum of yeasts that makes traditional kefir faintly effervescent is usually excluded because carbonation complicates bottling. Strains that produce the widest range of bioactive peptides are often the ones most sensitive to industrial processing, and they are the first to drop out. Traditional grain-cultured kefir contains dozens of strains that simply cannot be replicated in a factory, including robust populations of Lactobacillus kefiranifaciens, which research suggests may contribute to producing kefirin and has been studied for immune-modulating properties in laboratory models. Commercial kefir rarely contains this strain in meaningful quantity. Kombucha never does. This is one of the reasons the title's 5 times faster claim holds up under scrutiny. You are comparing a narrow microbial delivery system to a broad one. The body, particularly the gut, has historically been observed to respond to breadth. There's a specific observation from first-century Judean households that tracks with modern gut health thinking. Family members who drank the sour milk daily were reported to recover faster from what we would today call dysentery or general gastrointestinal distress. Physician Dioscorides, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, recommended fermented milk for patients recovering from stomach complaints. The Talmud records similar advice, particularly for the elderly and for women recovering from childbirth. Galen, a few generations later, described fermented milk preparations as useful for restoring strength after illness. What they were observing, without the vocabulary to describe it, was what modern research would later associate with the rapid recolonization of a gut that had been stripped by infection, antibiotics, or prolonged poor diet. A 2017 paper in Food Microbiology examined the survival of kefir-derived lactobacillus strains through simulated gastric and intestinal conditions, and reported that a significant fraction of the original microbial load reached the lower intestine intact, which is exactly where colonization matters. Research suggests that broad-spectrum probiotic intake is associated with this kind of repopulation effect. It does not cure the illness, it may support the terrain, and the terrain, once restored, does the rest of the work. How did something so central to ancient daily life nearly disappear from Western tables? The short answer is industrialization. Until roughly the mid-19th century, most European and Middle Eastern households still kept some form of fermented dairy on hand, whether it was kefir in the Caucasus, Laban in the Levant, Vili in Scandinavia, or soured cream and buttermilk across the American frontier. Then pasteurization arrived, followed by refrigeration, followed by the industrial consolidation of dairy into a handful of national brands. Fresh, sweet, shelf-stable milk became the default. Sour was reframed as spoiled. Within 2 generations, the knowledge of passing a living mother culture from mother to daughter was largely lost in urban households. By the mid-20th century, most Western families had no fermented dairy in their daily routine at all, beyond perhaps a tub of commercial yogurt. The grain cultures survived in traditional households across the Caucasus, parts of the Middle East, rural Eastern Europe, and pockets of immigrant diaspora. What you are rediscovering now was, for most of human history, simply breakfast. Let me be practical. You can make this at home with a modest amount of effort and a small investment. You need real kefir grains. These are not the same thing as powdered starter or freeze-dried cultures, though those will produce a functional product. Grains are living cultures. You buy them once from a reputable source, and they multiply. Feed them fresh whole milk daily, or store them in milk in the refrigerator for up to a week between uses. 2 tablespoons of grains cultured in 2 cups of whole milk, at room temperature for 18 to 24 hours, will produce 1 full batch of traditional kefir. Strain through a non-metal sieve. Return the grains to fresh milk for the next batch. Store the finished kefir in the refrigerator. Drink 1 cup per day, preferably in the morning on an empty stomach, or as part of breakfast. A few notes on quality. Whole milk performs better than low-fat milk because many of the beneficial compounds are fat-soluble. Raw milk, if legally available in your area and properly sourced, produces a more complex culture, but pasteurized whole milk works well and is safer for new fermenters. Goat milk, the original biblical base, gives a slightly different microbial profile and is easier to digest for many people. Organic is preferable because antibiotic residues in conventional dairy can disrupt the culture. And never, ever use metal utensils in extended contact with the grains. Brief contact with stainless steel is fine, but aluminum or other reactive metals can harm the culture. Use wood, plastic, or glass. Troubleshooting matters, because a living culture will occasionally tell you something is wrong. If your grains stop thickening the milk, the first question is temperature. Below about 65 degrees Fahrenheit, the culture slows dramatically, and below 60 it may stall out entirely. Move the jar to a warmer counter. If the milk itself refuses to culture even at the right temperature, the problem is almost always the milk. Ultra-pasteurized milk, the kind labeled UHT, has been heated high enough to denature the proteins the bacteria use as a scaffold, and grains often cannot convert it. Switch to standard pasteurized whole milk, ideally not ultra-filtered, and the grains usually wake up within 2 cycles. If the grains shrink, turn slimy, or develop an off smell that is not simply sour, they are stressed. Rinse them gently in clean filtered water, return them to fresh whole milk, and give them 2 or 3 rest cycles before expecting a full batch. If pink, orange, or black spots appear, discard the batch entirely and start fresh from a backup. Healthy grains are firm, cream-colored, and smell like tangy fresh yogurt. Keep a spare portion of grains in the refrigerator as insurance. A good culture, treated well, will feed a household for decades. Here's what the taste will be. If you're expecting the smooth, sweet, flavored kefir from the grocery store, this will surprise you. It's sharp, it's tangy, it's almost effervescent, with a faint yeasty note sitting underneath the acid. The first few sips take adjustment, particularly for anyone raised on sweetened dairy products. But after a week, most people begin to anticipate the taste the way a seasoned coffee drinker anticipates the bitterness of a proper espresso. The palate recalibrates. The sourness begins to feel clean rather than aggressive. You can improve the flavor with a pinch of sea salt, a drop of honey, a few drops of vanilla, or blended fresh fruit such as berries, peach, or banana. Traditional Middle Eastern consumption sometimes added cucumber, mint, or dill, producing a savory drink often paired with flatbread and olive oil. In Persian and Turkish households, the salted version, sometimes called dough or ayran, was the standard accompaniment to a hot midday meal. The simplest variation is plain kefir, with a single teaspoon of raw honey stirred in just before drinking, which is also, incidentally, how scripture repeatedly references the sweetness offered alongside milk. What this all points to is something larger than one drink. The biblical understanding of food recognized that fermentation was not an act of preservation only. It was an act of partnership with unseen life. The God of Scripture filled the air and the soil and the milk with invisible organisms, and the human role was to create the conditions under which those organisms would produce something more nourishing than the raw material. Bread rose because something alive was at work. Wine deepened because something alive was at work. Milk thickened and tanged because something alive was at work. None of this was framed as coincidence. 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 19 calls the body a temple. A temple needs its own living community. The gut, which science now recognizes as home to the second largest concentration of neurons outside the brain and a major site of immune regulation, is that community. Feeding it well was historically treated not as optional, but as woven into the ordinary practice of daily meals, the same way one would not consider skipping bread or water. So try this for 3 weeks. Source a small portion of kefir grains. Set up a daily rhythm. 1 cup each morning, ideally before anything else touches your stomach. Keep the grains happy. Feed them fresh whole milk. Pay attention to the small things. The way the drink thickens overnight. The way the smell changes subtly from one batch to the next. The way your own hunger patterns begin to shift. Notice changes gradually. The shift will not be dramatic at first. It will be subtle, digestion steadier, energy more consistent, something harder to name at the base of how the body simply feels. Research in this area is ongoing, and individual responses vary, but the pattern reported across centuries is remarkably consistent. And if after 21 days you notice the shift, share this with someone who has been cycling through expensive probiotic supplements looking for relief. There is an older, simpler, more complete answer that has been hiding in plain sight. Scripture kept it on the table for 3,000 years, not as a health trend, but as a daily staple. A drink poured for travelers and children and the aging alike. Modern laboratories, with their gene sequencers and their peptide arrays and their microbiome maps, are only now catching up to what a Judean household already understood by the simple evidence of how their people lived. The leather vessels swayed in the corner of the kitchen. The grains were fed again tonight. Tomorrow, there will be another cup. Bookmark this. Save the preparation steps somewhere, you will find them again. You'll come back to it.